The old mountains had their secrets, and Ranger Elias Ward had his. For 15 years, he'd patrolled these borderlands alone, speaking more to his horse than to any human soul. The townsfolk called him strange, a man more comfortable with wilderness than with their company. They didn't understand why he chose solitude over society, why he'd turn away from a warm hearth to sleep under cold stars. What they didn't know was that Elias carried wounds deeper than any knife could cut, wounds that bled whenever he heard laughter or saw families gathered close. But fate has curious ways of healing what's broken. Sometimes salvation comes with fur and fangs and wild golden eyes. What happens when the most dangerous predator in the mountains becomes a lonely man's only friend? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn painted the mountains gold as Ranger Elias Ward made his morning rounds. 15 years on these trails had etched the path into his bones. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged to the wilderness more than to any town or settlement. His horse, Thunder, knew the routine as well as he did. Check the eastern ridge, patrol the river crossing, then circle back toward Timber Creek before midday. Elias ran weathered fingers across his beard, now showing the first strands of gray. 45 years had carved lines around his eyes that deepened when he squinted against the sun. The mountains had been kinder to him than people ever were. They asked nothing, expected nothing, and judged nothing, just the way he preferred it. At the ridge overlooking Timber Creek, Elias dismounted. The town looked peaceful from up here, a collection of wooden structures nestled in the valley, smoke rising from morning fires. He pulled his tattered journal from his saddlebag, its leather cover worn smooth from years of handling. Opening to a fresh page, he noted the date and weather conditions, then added first elk herds moving to lower pastures. Winter will come early this year. The journal contained 15 years of such observations. Weather patterns, animal migrations, changes in the forest. But between those practical notes were other entries, thoughts he'd never speak aloud. Memories of Anna's laugh, little Sarah's first steps, the way firelight had danced in their eyes the night before they were taken from him. Thunder nickered softly, bringing Elias back to the present. He closed the journal and tucked it away. No use dwelling in the past. The dead stayed dead. The main street of Timber Creek was already bustling when Elias rode in. Folks nodded respectfully but kept their distance. That suited him fine. He'd earned their respect as the ranger who kept the mountain passes safe, who warned of coming storms, who tracked down lost children and wandering elders. But respect wasn't the same as welcome, and both sides seemed content with the arrangement. Ward, hold up there. Sheriff Harlan Blackwood waved from the jailhouse steps. At 62, the sheriff moved slower these days, but his mind remained sharp. He was perhaps the closest thing Elias had to a friend, though neither man would have used that word. Harlan, Elias acknowledged with a nod. Got some complaints about Clayton Ross setting traps too close to town again, the sheriff said, keeping his voice low. Miller's dog came back yesterday with one clamped on its leg. Had to be put down. Elias's jaw tightened. I'll have a word with him. Rather you than me. Ben's got a temper worse than a wounded bear. As if summoned by his name, Clayton Ross emerged from the general store. Tall and barrel-chested with a perpetual scowl beneath his unkempt beard, Clayton made his living selling furs. He'd made no secret of his dislike for the ranger, who regularly destroyed his traps when they encroached on protected land. Their eyes met across the street. Clayton spat on the ground and deliberately turned his back. Town meeting tonight, Harlan continued, pretending not to notice the exchange. Folks are getting nervous about winter. Say they've seen unusual tracks up near Widow's Peak, bigger than normal wolf prints. Probably just passing through, Elias replied, though something in his gut tightened. He'd noticed the tracks too, a large wolf moving alone, unusual for the species. Later, as Elias prepared to leave town, Dr. Martha Sullivan called out from her clinic doorway. At 38, she maintained a professional warmth that she extended even to the solitary ranger. Mr. Ward, been a while since your last checkup. been healthy," he answered simply. Martha sighed. "One day you'll learn that prevention beats cure. At least take some of these willow bark packets, for when your old wounds ache in the cold." Elias accepted the small package with a nod of thanks. Martha was one of the few who didn't seem bothered by his reticence. Perhaps because as the town's doctor, she knew something of his physical scars, if not the deeper ones he carried. As he rode back toward his cabin in the fading light, the wind carried a sound that made him pause. A distant howl, long, mournful, and strangely compelling. Thunder shifted nervously beneath him. "Easy," Elias murmured, both to his horse and to himself. Something was changing in his mountains. He could feel it in the air, see it in the early migration of the elk, hear it in that lone wolf's call. Winter was coming early, and it would not be kind. That night Elias added one more line to his journal before sleeping. "The mountains are restless. Something is coming." The first heavy snow of the season came 3 weeks earlier than usual. Elias stood at his cabin door, watching white flakes swirl against the dawn sky. The early winter had confirmed his suspicions. Nature's rhythms were shifting, and animals would be desperate for food sooner than expected. He tucked his father's old brass spyglass into his coat pocket. The tarnished instrument had guided 2 generations of wardmen through these mountains. Its scratched lens had spotted game trails, spotted forest fires, and once spotted the dust cloud of riders that would bring death to his door. Now it would help him track whatever was leaving those oversized prints without getting too close. By mid-morning, Elias had found fresh tracks in the new snow, massive paw prints that confirmed the rumors. A wolf, unlike any he'd seen in these parts, was roaming the high country. From the depth and pattern, he estimated it weighed at least 150 pounds, half again the size of typical grey wolves in the region. "What brings you so far from your pack, big fellow?" Elias murmured, kneeling to examine the prints more closely. From a nearby ridge, unseen eyes watched him. Had Elias looked up at just the right moment and used his spyglass, he might have glimpsed a shadow moving between the trees. But the watcher remained hidden, as it had for weeks now. Clayton Ross slammed his fist on Sheriff Harlan's desk. 3 more sheep taken from the Peterson place last night. How many more losses before you do something about these predators? The sheriff maintained his calm. "We don't know it was wolves, Clayton. Don't give me that. We all know what's happening. That giant wolf the ranger won't deal with is getting bolder." Martha Sullivan, who had been treating Harlan's arthritis when Clayton burst in, spoke up. "Predators are part of these mountains, Mr. Ross. Always have been." Clayton sneered. Easy for the town doctor to say. "You're not losing your livelihood." "Neither are you," Sheriff Harlan pointed out. "Last I checked, your trapping business was doing just fine, despite placing snares where they don't belong." Clayton's face darkened. "I've got a right to protect my interests. And if Ward keeps cutting my trap lines, he and I are going to have more than words." After Clayton stormed out, Martha sighed. "That man carries a darkness in him." "Always has," Harlan agreed, flexing his stiff fingers. "Getting worse lately, too. Keep an eye on Elias if you see him." Clayton's not one for idle threats. The old native man everyone called Joseph was waiting when Elias returned to his cabin. How the 70-year-old had made it up the snowy trail without leaving tracks was a mystery Elias had long since stopped trying to solve. "You seek the great wolf," Joseph stated, warming his hands by Elias's freshly stoked fire. Elias hung his coat. "Just tracking it, making sure it stays away from the settlements." Joseph's weathered face creased in a knowing smile. "The wolf is not what the townsfolk should fear this winter." Meaning, the wolf walks alone because it chooses to. Others come who walk alone because they are cast out. Hungry men are more dangerous than hungry wolves. Elias poured them both coffee. Joseph was one of the few people whose company didn't drain him. Perhaps because the old man never demanded conversation, offering wisdom when needed and silence when preferred. "There's something else," Joseph continued, his voice lowering. "The wolf you track, it has known men before." Elias raised an eyebrow. "A captive?" Joseph nodded. "Taken as a cub, raised among men until it grew too powerful to control. It escaped during the first autumn frost. It knows human ways, their strengths and their weaknesses. How do you know this? Joseph merely sipped his coffee, his eyes distant. The mountains speak to those who listen. You hear them too, Ranger. That's why you choose their company over men's. After Joseph left, Elias pulled out his spyglass and climbed to the small lookout behind his cabin. The dying light caught on the brass as he scanned the snow-covered slopes. In the valley below, the lights of Timber Creek flickered on one by one, so far from them, yet charged with their protection. The contradiction wasn't lost on Elias. He protected people he couldn't bring himself to live among, while feeling more kinship with the wilderness they feared. Through the scratched lens, he spotted movement on the northern ridge, a flash of gray against white snow. The wolf was circling closer, watching, perhaps, as intently as Elias himself. That night the howl came again, closer this time. A single voice echoing through the darkness, carrying notes of both defiance and loneliness that resonated deep in Elias's chest. Man and wolf, each patrolling their territory, each solitary by choice or circumstance, each watching the other from a distance. For now, the storm hit without warning. One moment Elias was tracking prints along the northern ridge. The next, he was fighting to see through a blinding curtain of snow. The temperature plummeted as wind howled down from the high peaks, carrying ice particles that stung any exposed skin. "Easy, Thunder," Elias murmured to his nervous horse. "We'll find shelter." He'd been following the wolf's trail for 3 days now. The massive predator had been circling closer to Timber Creek, though strangely no more livestock had been reported missing since the Peterson incident. Something about the pattern bothered Elias. The wolf seemed to be patrolling rather than hunting. A flash of metal caught his eye through the swirling snow. Dismounting, Elias pushed through a thicket of pine and discovered what he'd feared, one of Clayton's illegal traps, well beyond the boundaries where trapping was permitted. Even worse, this wasn't a simple snare, but a toothed steel trap, banned throughout the territory for its cruelty. "Damn you, Clayton," he muttered, marking the spot in his mind to return later. That's when he heard it, a low, pained whimper carried on the wind. Not human, but not quite animal either. Something between a growl and a cry. Elias hesitated. The storm was worsening by the minute, and Thunder was growing increasingly skittish. The sensible choice was to seek shelter immediately. But that sound— "Wait here," he told his horse, tying the reins to a protected spot beneath a rocky overhang. He followed the sound through deepening snow, his red flannel shirt bright against the whiteness. The wind cut through the worn fabric, but years in these mountains had made him resistant to all but the most punishing cold. The whimpering grew louder. Pushing through a dense stand of young pines, Elias stopped short at the sight before him. There, caught in one of Clayton's steel traps, was the wolf he'd been tracking. Massive and grey, with hints of black along its back, the creature was far larger than any wolf Elias had encountered in 15 years of ranging. Its leg was caught in the cruel metal jaws, blood staining the snow beneath it crimson. The wolf's golden eyes locked onto Elias, filled with pain, fear, and something else, a fierce intelligence that made the ranger take a step back. "Easy now," Elias said softly. Though he knew his words meant nothing to the wild animal, the wolf growled, baring teeth that could crush bone with ease. It tried to lunge at him, but the trap held firm, causing it to yelp in renewed pain. 15 years as a ranger had taught Elias the protocol for this situation. A wolf this large, already injured and cornered, posed a clear danger. The humane action was to put it down quickly. His hand moved to his rifle, then stopped. Something in those golden eyes held him, a dignity, a defiance that mirrored something in his own soul. This wasn't an ordinary predator. Joseph's words echoed in his mind. "It has known men before." "I ain't your enemy," Elias said, slowly reaching for his hunting knife instead. "But you're not going to like what comes next." Keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening, he approached from the side. The wolf watched him, muscles tensed, teeth still bared. One wrong move and those jaws would close on his arm or throat. Kneeling in the snow, Elias examined the trap. The mechanism was rusted but strong. He'd need leverage to spring it open, and the wolf would need to remain still, an unlikely combination. "This is gonna hurt us both, I expect," he murmured. Using his knife and considerable strength, Elias pried at the trap's mechanism. The wolf snarled and snapped, catching the sleeve of his red flannel shirt, tearing fabric and grazing skin beneath. Blood, his own now, joined the wolf's on the snow. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Elias continued working. The trap groaned, then suddenly gave way with a metallic snap. Free of the crushing pressure, the wolf pulled its injured leg away, leaving fur and blood on the steel teeth. For a moment, predator and man locked eyes again. The wolf lunged forward, not toward its damaged leg, but at Elias. The ranger fell backward into the snow, certain his throat would be torn open in seconds. Instead, the wolf stopped, muzzle inches from his face. Its breath came in steaming pants, golden eyes boring into his. Then, with a final growl that seemed almost like acknowledgement, it turned and limped away into the storm, leaving a trail of blood in the virgin snow. Elias lay there, heart pounding, blood seeping through his torn sleeve. His red flannel shirt, now ripped and stained with both his blood and the wolf's, would never be the same. Neither, he suspected, would he. Consciousness returned to Elias in fragments. First came the pain, a throbbing in his left arm and a deep ache in his chest from breathing the frigid air for too long. Next was the realization he was moving, slumped forward in his saddle. Thunder, faithful Thunder, was picking his way carefully down the mountain trail, somehow finding the path through diminishing snowfall. How long had he lain in the snow after freeing the wolf? How had he managed to find his horse and mount up? The details were hazy, lost in the blurred edges of blood loss and early hypothermia. "Gotta make it back," he mumbled through cracked lips. Thunder's ears flicked back at his voice, but the horse kept its steady pace. The sky had darkened, not just from the storm, but from the coming night. Elias fought to stay conscious, knowing that sleep now might mean never waking. His cabin appeared through the trees like a mirage, lamplight glowing from the window. Had he left a lamp burning? No, he was always careful about fire. As Thunder approached, the cabin door swung open. A figure rushed toward him. "My God, Elias!" Martha Sullivan. The doctor's weekly visit to check on remote homesteads. Today, of all days, his strength finally gave out as she reached for him. Elias slid from the saddle into darkness. The bone needle pierced his skin again, sending fresh pain radiating up his arm. Elias gritted his teeth, but couldn't suppress a groan. "Almost done," Martha murmured, her face tight with concentration as she drew the catgut thread through the ragged edges of his wound. "What did this? Bear trap?" "Wolf," he managed. "Caught in a trap." "I freed it." Martha's hands paused momentarily. "You freed a trapped wolf?" Instead of shooting it, Elias didn't answer. How could he explain what he'd seen in those golden eyes? "You're lucky it didn't tear your throat out," she continued, resuming her stitching. "The wound isn't deep, but it's already showing signs of infection. I've cleaned it as best I can." The fire in his small hearth crackled, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Elias's gaze drifted to the window, to the darkness beyond. Was the wolf still out there, injured and alone? "You're running a fever," Martha said, tying off the final stitch. "These tools aren't ideal, but they'll hold until we can get you to my clinic. Not going to town." His voice was rough, but determined. "Don't be stubborn. That wound needs proper, no town," he repeated. "I'll be fine here." Martha sighed, putting away her bone needle and remaining catgut in a small leather case. "Always the lone wolf, aren't you, Elias?" The irony of her words wasn't lost on him. "Clayton's been stirring up trouble," she said after a moment. "Convinced half the town that wolves are threatening their livestock and children. Sheriff Harlan's having a hard time keeping him in check." "Clayton's traps are illegal," Elias muttered. "Set beyond permitted boundaries, using banned mechanisms. That won't matter much to folks who are scared." Martha placed a cool cloth on his forehead. "Fear makes people irrational, makes them look for something to blame. Right now, that's wolves, Elias tried to sit up, but dizziness forced him back down. "Need to report. You need to rest," she said firmly, pressing him back against the pillow. "I'll ride to town tomorrow and let the sheriff know where you are and what happened. Though maybe we should leave out the part where you risked your life to save a predator." Through the cabin window, the moon had risen, casting silver light across the snow-covered landscape. A sudden movement caught Elias's eye, a shadow passing across the moonlit clearing. "Just for a moment, did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Martha turned toward the window. "See what?" "Nothing," he said after a pause. "Just the fever playing tricks." But later, after Martha had fallen asleep in the chair beside his bed, Elias heard it, the soft crunch of paws on snow outside his cabin. A low, rumbling sound that might have been a growl or might have been something else entirely. By morning, when Martha went to fetch water, she found strange tracks circling the cabin, massive paw prints in the fresh snow. And more curious still, a freshly killed rabbit laid on the doorstep, its neck broken cleanly. She said nothing about it to Elias, but something in her eyes when she looked at him had changed. A mixture of concern, curiosity, and something else. A dawning realization that there was more to the solitary ranger than she had ever suspected. 3 nights after Martha's departure, the blizzard returned with renewed fury. Wind howled around Elias's cabin, finding every crack and crevice, whispering cold fingers through the logs. His arm throbbed beneath the bandages, the fever finally broken, but leaving him weak and irritable. The sound came between gusts, a soft scratching at his door. Elias froze, his good hand instinctively reaching for his rifle before stopping. Something told him it wasn't a threat. Not the usual kind, anyway. The scratching came again, followed by a low whine, heart-hammering. Elias crossed to the door and hesitated only briefly before pulling it open. There, illuminated by the cabin's lamplight against the swirling snow, stood the wolf. Its golden eyes reflected the flame, like twin candles in the darkness. Its injured leg was held slightly aloft, the fur matted with blood and dirt. The massive creature looked thinner than before, the harsh weather making hunting difficult, especially for a predator with a wounded limb. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the wolf took a single limping step forward. "You're a fool to come here," Elias said softly. "I might not be the only human you meet." The wolf's ears flicked at his voice, but showed no fear. Instead, it took another halting step toward the door's warmth, against every shred of common sense. Elias stepped aside. "If you've come for shelter," he said, echoing words from another life to another wounded soul. "Oh, there's room." The wolf hesitated, then limped inside, bringing the smell of snow, pine, and wild animal into the cabin's close confines. It kept its distance from Elias, circling the room once, before settling in the corner furthest from him, but nearest the fire's warmth. Elias moved slowly, reaching for a simple clay bowl he used for stew. He filled it with water and set it halfway between them on the floor. "Your leg needs tending," he said conversationally, as though the wolf might understand. Perhaps, having been raised among humans as Joseph had claimed, it did comprehend something of his meaning, if not his words. The wolf watched him warily, its massive head resting on its paws, eyes never leaving Elias as he moved about the cabin. After several minutes, it rose painfully and approached the water bowl. It drank deeply, then returned to its corner. "Hungry too, I'd wager," Elias muttered. He had dried venison hanging from a roof beam. Cutting a few strips, he placed them in the same clay bowl and set it down again. By morning the meat was gone, and the wolf remained, curled in the corner, its breaths coming in sleepy, regular patterns. The blizzard continued unabated, making the decision to allow the predator to stay easier. Neither of them would survive long in that weather. Elias spent the day observing his unusual guest, while pretending not to. The wolf did the same, each aware of the other, neither making sudden moves, an unspoken truce forming between them. When night fell again, Elias unwrapped his own bandages to check his healing wound. The wolf lifted its head, watching intently. "Your turn," Elias said quietly. The standoff lasted nearly an hour, Elias sitting patiently on the floor, a cloth and his remaining medical supplies set before him. Finally, the wolf rose and limped toward him, stopping just outside arm's reach. "I won't hurt you," Elias promised, "but this will sting some." Slowly, telegraphing every movement, he reached toward the wolf's injured leg. The massive jaws could have removed his hand in an instant. Instead, the wolf remained still, only a slight growl rumbling in its chest when Elias's fingers made contact with the wound. The trap had cut deep, infection setting in despite the cold. Using water from the clay bowl, Elias cleaned the wound as best he could. The wolf never moved, though the growl continued, not threatening, but as if the animal was speaking its pain the only way it knew how. "You've known men before," Elias murmured, recalling Joseph's words. "Not kind ones, I'd guess." When he finished, the wolf limped back to the corner, but settled facing Elias rather than the wall, a small shift that spoke volumes. As the blizzard's second night descended, Elias found himself talking. At first, just practical things about the weather and hunting conditions. Then as darkness deepened and the fire burned low, words he hadn't spoken in 15 years began to emerge. "Had a family once," he said to the golden eyes watching from the shadows. "Wife, daughter, cabin not unlike this one." The wolf's ears twitched forward as if listening. "Bandits took them. Took everything." His voice had grown hoarse. "Been alone since." The wolf blinked slowly, its massive head tilting slightly. "Guess you and I have that in common," Elias said. "Both alone, both carrying scars." Outside, the wind gradually quieted, the storm's fury spent at last. Inside, two solitary hunters watched the fire's embers fade to darkness, separated by species and experience, yet somehow sharing the same silence. Days slipped into a week. Elias and the wolf established an uneasy routine in the small cabin. The massive predator claimed the corner near the hearth as its territory, while Elias maintained his normal spaces. They moved around each other in a careful dance, neither fully trusting, both watchful, yet gradually relaxing in subtle ways. Elias named him Shadow, for the way the wolf seemed to materialize from darkness, for his gray-black coat, for the way he followed Elias with his eyes, never letting him move out of sight. The wolf's leg was healing, though more slowly than Elias would have liked. Infection lingered, despite his best efforts with the limited medical supplies Martha had left behind. His own wound was closing cleanly, the stitches ready to be removed. "She'll be back to check on me soon," Elias told Shadow as he eased himself up from his chair, using a cedar walking stick he'd carved to take pressure off his still weakened leg. "The doctor." "She can't find you here." Shadow watched him, head tilted as if considering the words. "Folks in town are scared enough of wolves as it is." Elias moved to the door, leaning heavily on the walking stick. "If they knew I was sheltering you." He let the thought go unfinished as he pushed open the cabin door. Bright winter sunshine flooded in, reflecting off pristine snow. The storm had passed, leaving a transformed landscape of white drifts and ice-laden branches. Shadow rose slowly, limping to the doorway but stopping at the threshold. His golden eyes narrowed against the brightness. "Go on then," Elias said, stepping aside. "You're healing. And time you went back where you belong." The wolf looked at the open door, then back at Elias. He made no move to leave. "Don't be a fool," Elias muttered. "Your kind isn't welcome among men." Still the wolf remained, stubbornly fixed in place. With a sigh, Elias stepped outside, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. He used the walking stick to steady himself, testing his strength. Shadow watched from the doorway, a low whine building in his throat. "What?" Elias asked, turning back. "You coming or not?" The wolf took one tentative step onto the porch, then another. His injured leg touched the wooden planks gingerly, testing its strength much as Elias had done. "That's it," Elias encouraged, surprising himself with the softness in his voice. Together, man and wolf ventured into the winter morning, Elias with his cedar stick, Shadow with his healing leg. They made a strange pair, both moving slowly, compensating for their injuries, keeping close as they circled the cabin clearing. It was during this careful patrol that Elias spotted horsemen approaching through the trees. 3 riders, still distant but unmistakably headed his way. One he recognized immediately. Clayton Ross's hulking form was distinctive even at a distance. "Inside," he said sharply to Shadow. Now, whether the wolf understood the words or merely the urgent tone, he turned immediately, limping quickly back to the cabin. Elias followed, closing the door behind them just as the riders entered the far side of the clearing. "Stay quiet," he told Shadow, who had retreated to his corner. And out of sight, a heavy knock came moments later. Elias opened the door to find Clayton and 2 men he recognized as trappers from the North Ridge. "Ross," he acknowledged coldly. "What brings you this far up mountain?" Clayton's eyes were hard beneath his fur cap. "Hunting party. Got reports of that monster wolf circling back this way." His gaze flicked past Elias, scanning what he could see of the cabin interior. "Sheriff said you were laid up with an injury. Thought we'd check if you'd seen any sign of it." "Haven't seen anything unusual," Elias replied, blocking the doorway with his body. "Been inside mostly. Healing." One of the other men pointed to the snow. "Those tracks look mighty big for a coyote, Ranger." Elias didn't flinch. "Wolves pass through from time to time. None big enough to cause concern? Mind if we look around?" Clayton asked, though his tone made it clear it wasn't really a question. "I do mind," Elias said, straightening to his full height, despite the pain it caused his healing wound. "This is my property, Ross, and I'm telling you there's nothing here worth hunting." The standoff lasted several heartbeats. Behind him, Elias could feel Shadow's presence, knew the wolf was listening, perhaps even understanding the danger. Finally, Clayton spat into the snow. "Town meeting tomorrow night. Sheriff wants you there if you're well enough to travel. Folks are scared, Ward. They want something done about these predators." His eyes narrowed. "With or without your help." After they rode away, Elias closed the door and leaned against it, suddenly exhausted. Shadow emerged from where he'd hidden behind Elias's bed. "This can't last," Elias told him softly. "You understand that, don't you?" The wolf looked at him with those intelligent golden eyes. And Elias had the uncomfortable feeling that Shadow understood far more than any wild animal should. The town hall was packed tight as a barrel when Elias arrived. Faces turned toward him, some concerned, others hostile, most simply afraid. He felt their eyes on his still bandaged arm, noted the whispers that followed him down the aisle. Sheriff Harlan nodded from the front, gesturing to an empty chair beside him. "Didn't think you'd make it," Harlan murmured, as Elias settled in. "Wasn't sure I would," Elias replied. He'd left Shadow at the cabin with clear instructions to stay hidden, though whether the wolf understood or would obey remained uncertain. Clayton Ross stood at the front of the room, his voice carrying over the crowd. 7 confirmed attacks on livestock in the past month. Peterson lost 3 more sheep just yesterday. "This ain't normal behavior, folks." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered townsfolk. "What we're dealing with," Clayton continued, "is a rogue wolf, bigger than any seen in these parts before. Smart, too. Too smart." Elias shifted uncomfortably. The description was accurate, yet something felt wrong about the way Clayton presented it, as though he had personal knowledge of the wolf's intelligence. "Ranger Ward," Clayton called, turning all eyes to Elias. "You've been tracking this creature. Tell the folks what you've found." Elias rose slowly, buying time to choose his words carefully. "There is a wolf in the high country, larger than most. I followed its tracks after the first livestock incident, but I found no conclusive evidence linking it to the recent attacks." "No evidence?" Clayton scoffed. "What about those massive prints around the Peterson place?" "I examined those tracks," Elias replied evenly. "They were made by at least 3 different wolves, normal-sized ones. Not the larger animal I've been tracking." Clayton's face darkened. "You calling me a liar, Ward?" "I'm saying there's more to this than one rogue wolf." Elias turned to address the townspeople directly. "Predators are part of these mountains. Always have been. But they generally avoid human settlements unless desperate." Martha Sullivan stood from her place, near the back. "Is it possible something's forcing them down from the high country? The early winter, perhaps?" "It's possible," Elias acknowledged. But enough excuses, Clayton interrupted. While the ranger here makes friends with these beasts, our livelihoods are being threatened. I say we form a hunting party and put an end to this problem once and for all. Cheers erupted from Clayton's supporters. Sheriff Harlan raised his hands for quiet. Before we decide anything, the sheriff said, there's another matter we need to discuss. He reached into his vest and withdrew a weathered envelope. Got this letter from the territorial marshal yesterday. There's been reports of a gang moving through the northern settlements. 4 men, heavily armed, led by someone calling himself Raven. The name hit Elias like a physical blow. Raven, the outlaw who had led the attack on his homestead 15 years ago. The man who had murdered Anna and little Sarah while Elias was away hunting. The ghost he'd been chasing ever since. They've hit 3 small towns already, Harlan continued, oblivious to Elias's reaction. Robbed the general store in Piney Ridge, shot the banker in Cold Creek. Marshall thinks they might be headed this way next. All the more reason to deal with these wolves now, Clayton insisted. We can't be worrying about predators from the mountains when we might have 2-legged predators coming as well. Elias barely heard the ensuing debate. His mind was racing, old memories surging to the surface. Raven, here in this territory again after all these years. Elias. Martha's voice broke through his thoughts. She had moved to sit beside him while the discussion continued. Are you all right? You've gone pale. I know him, Elias said quietly. Raven, I know who he is. Martha's eyes widened slightly. The outlaw? How? But Elias shook his head, rising abruptly. I need to go. He trailed off, uncertain how to explain the sudden urgency he felt. Outside, the night air was sharp with coming frost. Elias mounted Thunder and rode hard for his cabin, mind churning with the impossible convergence of past and present. If Raven was coming, everything changed. The wolf, the town, Clayton's vendetta, all of it paled beside the ghost from his past. Shadow met him at the cabin door, sensing Elias's agitation. The wolf had grown stronger in the days since their first encounter, his injured leg bearing weight more confidently. He watched with those intelligent eyes as Elias paced the small space, hands shaking as he pulled out his old rifle and began cleaning it with obsessive precision. He's coming back, Elias told the wolf, voice rough. The man who took everything from me. And this time, I'll be ready. Shadow moved closer, pressing his massive form against Elias's leg in what felt strangely like comfort. Man and wolf, each with their own ghosts, their own wounds. Each somehow becoming the other's anchor in a world suddenly tilting off its axis. Dawn found Elias on the high ridge above his cabin, studying the valley through his father's spyglass. Shadow sat beside him, a grey sentinel against the pristine snow. The wolf's leg had healed enough for him to move with only a slight limp, a remarkable recovery that spoke to the creature's resilience. Something's not right, Elias murmured, adjusting the spyglass. In the week since the town meeting, he'd spent every available moment tracking not wolves, but men. Sheriff Harlan's letter had mentioned 4 riders, but Elias had found tracks of 5 horses crossing the northern pass. 5 sets of prints, one consistently heavier than the others, a big man on a big horse. Lowering the spyglass, he turned to Shadow. Ready for a longer trek today? The wolf's ears perked forward, golden eyes alert. In the days they'd spent together, Shadow had proven himself not just intelligent, but seemingly attuned to Elias's moods and intentions. They communicated in a language of gestures, tones, and shared purpose that transcended the barrier between species. We're heading to the old mining camp, Elias explained, rising to his feet. If Raven and his gang are in these mountains, that's where they'd hole up. The abandoned mine had been a prosperous operation 20 years ago, before the silver vein ran dry. Now its weathered structures clung to the mountainside like forgotten memories. The collapsed shaft entrance, the foreman's cabin, the miner's bunkhouse. Perfect shelter for men who didn't want to be found. Elias approached cautiously, Shadow ghosting silently at his heels. The wolf seemed to understand the need for stealth, staying low and moving only when Elias moved. Fresh horse tracks led to the dilapidated stable, confirming Elias's suspicions. 5 horses, 4 average mounts, and 1 massive draft crossbreed. The kind Clayton Ross favored. "Stay," Elias whispered to Shadow. Drawing his rifle, the foreman's cabin showed signs of recent occupation, ashes still warm in the stove, playing cards scattered across a makeshift table, empty whiskey bottles littering the floor. But the occupants were gone, likely out scouting or hunting. A saddlebag hung from a peg by the door, its flap half open. Elias approached cautiously, ears straining for any sound of returning riders. The bag contained typical trail provisions, ammunition, and a folded piece of paper, a torn wanted poster. Yellowed with age, Elias unfolded it carefully, his breath catching at the familiar face staring back at him. Raven, real name Gabriel Holt, looking 15 years younger but unmistakable. The sketch captured his most distinctive features, the scar bisecting his left eyebrow, the cold, calculating eyes, the perpetual sneer. But it was what lurked in the background of the sketch that froze Elias's blood. A partial figure stood behind Raven, face obscured, but build unmistakable, broad-shouldered, barrel-chested, and on his vest, just barely visible, a distinctive pin in the shape of a bear's head, the same pin Clayton Ross wore every day. "Impossible," Elias breathed. A floorboard creaked behind him. Elias whirled, rifle raised, to find Joseph standing in the doorway, his ancient face grave. "Not impossible," the old man said softly. "The past never truly leaves us, Ranger. It merely waits for the right moment to return." "How did you—" "I follow the signs," Joseph replied simply. "As do you, as does your wolf brother." Outside, Shadow gave a single low growl. Someone was coming. Joseph moved with surprising speed for his age, pulling Elias toward a trapdoor, half hidden beneath a threadbare rug. "Down! Quickly!" The space beneath the cabin was tight and dark, smelling of damp earth and old timber. Joseph pulled the trapdoor shut just as boots thumped on the cabin's porch. "Telling you, it's the perfect setup," a voice was saying. Clayton's voice. "The town's already terrified of wolves. After the next attack, a human casualty this time, they'll be begging us to save them. And Ward." This voice was deeper, with a faint southern drawl. "He's not a man easily fooled or frightened. Ward has a weakness now," Clayton replied. "That wolf he's been hiding." "Yes, I know all about it. Been watching his cabin. Once we eliminate the Ranger, we control access to the old silver mine." "There's no silver left," the southern voice, Raven, objected. "That's what the mining company thought," Clayton said, his voice smug. "But I've found a new vein, deeper in the mountain. Worth a fortune to the man who controls it. With the deed I forged and you eliminating any questions about ownership, we'll be rich men by spring." Elias's hand tightened on his rifle. The pieces were falling into place. Clayton's obsession with the wolves, his illegal traps set near the abandoned mine, his eagerness to form hunting parties that kept townsfolk away from this area. "And the wolf attacks?" Raven asked. "My men have been killing livestock and leaving wolf tracks," Clayton explained. "Easy enough to do. Tomorrow night one of your boys gets mauled. We blame Ward's pet wolf and the town turns against him. When he tries to defend the beast, you step in and eliminate them both. Clean and simple," Raven agreed. "I like it." From his hiding place, Elias exchanged a look with Joseph. Nothing about this situation was clean or simple, and it was about to get considerably more complicated. Night had fallen by the time Elias and Joseph made it back to the Ranger's cabin. Shadow greeted them at the door, somehow having returned ahead of them through paths only a wolf could navigate. "We need to warn the town," Elias said, gathering his ammunition and spare pistol. "Clayton's planning to stage an attack tomorrow night, make it look like a wolf mauled someone." Joseph sat by the fire, his weathered hands extended toward the flames. "The town will not believe you over Clayton. Not without proof. I heard them planning it with my own ears." "The word of a man who lives with wolves," Joseph said gently, "against a respected businessman. Who will Sheriff Harlan believe?" Elias paced the small cabin, frustration building. The old man was right. Clayton had positioned himself perfectly, respected by the townsfolk, feared by those who opposed him. and now allied with the most dangerous outlaw in the territory. "There's something else troubling you," Joseph observed. Elias stopped pacing. "Raven, Gabriel Holt, he's the one who killed my family 15 years ago." Joseph nodded slowly. "I thought as much. The shadows in your eyes grow darker when you speak his name, and now he's working with Clayton." Elias slammed his fist against the wall. "Planning to kill again. To kill me, and to kill your wolf brother," Joseph added quietly. "Do not forget that part of their plan." Shadow had settled by the fire, golden eyes tracking Elias's movements. The wolf seemed to sense the tension, his massive body alert, despite his relaxed posture. "I need to get word to Martha and the sheriff," Elias decided. "They'll listen, even if the rest of the town won't." Joseph shook his head. "The doctor's attending a birth at the Peterson farm, and Sheriff Harlan rode to the next county this morning, something about gathering more information on these outlaws." "Then I'm on my own," Elias said grimly. "Not entirely." Joseph gestured to Shadow. "And perhaps I can be of some assistance as well." Elias studied the old man skeptically. "No disrespect, Joseph, but you must be 70 if you're a day." A smile creased Joseph's leather-like face. 78, actually. "And I was hunting these mountains before your father was born." He reached into his deerskin pouch and withdrew something that glinted in the firelight, a silver bullet. "I did not come unprepared." Elias took the bullet, examining it. "Silver?" "From the mine," Joseph confirmed, "before it was abandoned. I kept a small supply, knowing someday it might serve a purpose beyond mere metal." "Silver won't kill a man any better than lead," Elias said. "Though he pocketed the bullet regardless." "Perhaps not," Joseph agreed. "But it carries a weight that lead does not. A meaning, a symmetry," Elias understood then. The silver from the mine, the very thing Clayton and Raven were conspiring to steal, would be their undoing. There was a poetry to it that appealed to him. "I'll need to melt this down," he said. "Cast more. Enough for Raven and his entire gang." As Elias worked through the night, melting the silver and casting bullets, Joseph shared what he knew of Clayton's operation. The trapper had discovered the new silver vein months ago, while setting his lines deep in the old mine tunnels. He'd kept it secret, slowly laying groundwork to claim the land through forged deeds and manufactured threats that kept others away from the area. "The wolf attacks were convenient," Joseph explained. "A way to keep people fearful, focused on a threat that didn't truly exist, while the real predators moved among them." "And Shadow?" Elias asked, glancing at the wolf who had fallen asleep by the fire. "How does he fit into all this?" Joseph's expression grew grave. "The large wolf was not part of Clayton's plan. But when it appeared, escaped from captivity as I told you before, he saw an opportunity. A real wolf to blame for his manufactured attacks." Dawn was breaking when they finished preparations. Elias loaded his rifle and pistol with the newly cast silver bullets, their weight slightly different from his usual lead shot. "Clayton and Raven will move tonight," he said. "We need to intercept them before they can stage their attack." Joseph nodded. "I will go to the Peterson farm, ensure the doctor is safe, and bring her back to town. You must find a way to expose Clayton before the townsfolk." As Joseph prepared to leave, Elias stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "Why are you helping me? You've never taken sides in town matters before." The old man smiled faintly. "I take the side of the mountains, Ranger, and of those who respect them." His gaze shifted to Shadow. "Man and wolf working as brothers. There is an old story among my people about such a partnership. It ends with balance restored to the land." "And how does it begin?" Elias asked. "With a choice," Joseph replied. "A moment of mercy when killing would have been easier." He nodded toward Shadow's healing leg. "You've already written the beginning, Ranger Ward. Now we must see the story through to its end." Timber Creek looked different to Elias as he approached from the ridge, more vulnerable than he'd ever noticed before. Small wooden buildings clustered together, lamplight glowing from windows against the gathering dusk. Homes, businesses, people who'd carved a life from this rugged country, just as he once had, people who would soon be caught in Clayton and Raven's scheme unless he acted. Shadow moved like a grey ghost beside Elias's horse. The wolf had refused to stay behind, seemingly understanding the gravity of their mission. Over the weeks of their unlikely partnership, Elias had stopped questioning the animal's uncanny intelligence. Some things defied explanation. "We need allies," Elias murmured, more to himself than to the wolf. He dismounted at the edge of town, tethering Thunder in a stand of pines. Entering openly would cause panic with Shadow at his side. Instead, they circled to the rear of Martha's clinic, where a single lamp burned in the back room. Martha nearly screamed when Elias tapped at her window, her expression shifting from fear to confusion when she recognized him, then to disbelief when Shadow's massive form emerged from the shadows behind him. "Are you out of your mind?" she hissed after letting them in through the back door. "That's the wolf everyone's been hunting. This wolf has harmed no one," Elias replied. "The attacks on livestock, they're Clayton's doing. He's working with outlaws to scare the town so he can claim the old silver mine." Martha stared at him, then at Shadow, who had settled calmly by the door as if standing guard. "That's quite an accusation, Elias. I heard them planning it. Clayton and a man called Raven." The name still burned his throat. "They're going to stage an attack tonight. Make it look like a wolf killed someone." To her credit, Martha didn't dismiss him outright. She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I've never trusted Clayton, but the town council respects him. And with the sheriff away, we're on our own," Elias confirmed. Martha crossed to her desk, pulling out a sheet of paper. "Not entirely. There are people who will stand with us if they know the truth." She began sketching a rough map of the town. "The blacksmith, Henrik. He's no friend of Clayton's after being cheated on a business deal. And the schoolteacher, Miss Abernathy. She's been suspicious of these wolf attacks from the beginning." Elias watched as Martha marked locations on the map, potential allies and strategic positions. His respect for the doctor deepened. She had a tactician's mind beneath those healers' hands. "We'll need to secure the town hall," she continued. "It's where people will gather when the alarm is raised." She looked up at Elias. "How do you want to handle this? Go to each person individually?" "No time," Elias said grimly. "Clayton's men will move tonight. We need to be ready." A soft knock at the back door interrupted them. Shadow growled low in his throat, but there was no aggression in the sound, more like recognition. Joseph slipped inside, nodding to Martha. "The pieces are moving, Ranger. Clayton's men are gathering at the saloon. They have rifles and lanterns." "A hunting party?" Martha asked. "A firing squad," Joseph corrected. "Dressed as a hunting party." Elias studied the map Martha had drawn. "They'll want witnesses when they stage their attack. Somewhere public, but isolated enough to control who sees what." "The livery," Martha suggested, marking it on the map. "It's at the edge of town, but visible from the main street. Anyone responding to a commotion would see exactly what Clayton wants them to see. Then that's where we'll intercept them," Elias decided. "But first, we need to gather what allies we can, quietly." Within the hour, a small group had assembled in Martha's clinic. Henrik the blacksmith, his massive arms crossed over his chest. Miss Abernathy, the schoolteacher, her normally gentle eyes hard with resolve. Old Tom from the general store, who'd fought Comanches in his younger days and still kept a shotgun under his counter. Elias explained what he'd discovered, showing them the map with Martha's annotations. To his relief, none questioned his story. Clayton had made enemies of most independent-minded folks in town. "But why the wolf?" Miss Abernathy asked, glancing nervously at Shadow, who had remained unnervingly still throughout the meeting. "Why bring a wild animal into town? He's not just any wolf," Elias replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "And I'm not leaving him behind," Henrik laughed, a deep rumble in his chest. "Ranger's got himself a deputy with 4 legs and sharp teeth. I like it. We need to move now," Joseph urged. "Clayton's men will act when the moon rises." Elias nodded, looking around at the determined faces. A doctor, a blacksmith, a schoolteacher, a shopkeeper, an old native man, and a wolf. Not the army he would have chosen, but perhaps exactly the allies he needed. "Remember," he said, folding Martha's map and tucking it inside his coat. "Clayton and his men are expecting to control the narrative. to tell a story about a killer wolf and a ranger who couldn't be trusted. Our job is to reveal the true story before anyone gets hurt. Joseph placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. Stories have power, Ranger, but truth has more. He glanced at Shadow. And sometimes truth comes with teeth. Moonlight washed Timber Creek in silver as Elias took his position on the livery stable roof. Below, Shadow melted into the shadows between buildings, virtually invisible despite his size. The wolf had understood Elias's hand signals perfectly. Wait, watch, move, only when signaled. Elias touched the brass whistle at his neck. 3 quick blasts would alert his scattered allies if trouble started before the planned time. Martha was positioned in the clinic, ready to treat injuries. Henrik waited in his smithy across the street, his hammer and shotgun both within reach. Miss Abernathy and Old Tom had gathered several trusted townspeople in the church, ostensibly for a prayer meeting, but really to keep innocent civilians away from the coming confrontation. Through his spyglass, Elias spotted movement at the edge of town, 5 riders approaching slowly, leading a 6th riderless horse. Clayton's massive form was unmistakable in the lead, with Raven's leaner silhouette just behind him. The others would be Raven's gang members, ardent killers all. Joseph materialized beside Elias on the roof, moving with the silence of a lifetime spent in the wilderness. "They have a body," the old man whispered. Wrapped in canvas on the spare horse, Elias adjusted his spyglass. Sure enough, something bulky was draped across the riderless mount. Part of their plan: stage a wolf attack with a prepared corpse. The man they killed was not innocent, Joseph said. One of their own who became a liability. Elias didn't ask how Joseph knew this. The old man's knowledge often transcended normal explanation. "Where's the sheriff?" "Still away." Perhaps by Clayton's design. The riders stopped at the edge of town. Clayton dismounted, gesturing for 2 men to take the wrapped body toward the livery. The plan was becoming clear. They would plant the corpse, create a commotion, then discover the body with staged wolf tracks around it. "Ready?" Elias asked, checking his rifle loaded with silver bullets. Joseph nodded. The Wolf brother is in position as well. Below, Shadow had circled behind the livery, unseen by Clayton's approaching men. The wolf's golden eyes gleamed briefly in the moonlight, looking up toward Elias for confirmation. Man and wolf, communicating without sound or signal, a connection that had grown stronger with each passing day. Elias touched the brass whistle again, but didn't blow it yet. Timing would be crucial. Clayton's men reached the livery doors, the body slung between them. Raven remained with Clayton at the edge of town, watching. They were being cautious, letting expendable gang members take the risks. "They've brought wolf fur," Joseph observed. "To leave false evidence." Elias tightened his grip on his rifle. Not this time. The moment the men disappeared into the livery with their grisly package, Elias raised the brass whistle to his lips and blew 3 sharp blasts. The signal cut through the night, echoing off buildings. Immediately, Henrik emerged from his smithy, shotgun raised. Old Tom appeared at the church door, flanked by 4 determined-looking men. Martha stepped onto her clinic porch, a rifle that had belonged to her late husband held confidently in her hands. Clayton's head snapped up at the whistle, his expression changing from smugness to alarm as he saw armed townspeople emerging from multiple directions. He shouted something to Raven, who immediately drew his pistol. "Now," Elias murmured. Shadow burst from hiding, a grey streak in the moonlight. Not toward the men in the livery, as Clayton might have expected, but directly toward Raven and Clayton themselves. The wolf moved with astonishing speed for his size, covering ground in powerful bounds. Raven fired wildly, his shots going wide as panic overtook his aim. Clayton reached for his own weapon but fumbled, clearly not expecting to be the target. Elias stood, making himself visible on the livery roof. "Clayton Ross," he shouted, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. "You're finished?" From inside, the livery came shouts of confusion as the 2 men found themselves trapped. Henrik was moving toward the building, his massive frame blocking the exit. Raven recovered quickly, taking aim at Elias with cold precision. This was the moment, 15 years in the making. The man who had murdered Elias's family was looking up at him, finger tightening on the trigger. Elias raised his rifle, the silver bullet in the chamber catching a glint of moonlight. Justice, not revenge. Protection, not hatred. The lessons he'd learned from Shadow over these weeks steadied his hand. Before either man could fire, Shadow reached Clayton, knocking him to the ground with tremendous force. The wolf didn't bite or maul. He simply pinned the larger man, golden eyes boring into Clayton's terrified face. A clear message: I could kill you, but I choose not to. In that moment of distraction, Raven adjusted his aim, not at Elias, but at Shadow. No! Elias shouted, bringing his rifle to bear. 2 shots rang out in the night. 2 lives hanging in the balance, and the fate of Timber Creek trembling on the edge of a silver bullet's path. 2 shots echoed across Timber Creek, so close together they almost sounded as one. Silence followed, a moment suspended in time. Elias felt the kickback of his rifle against his shoulder. His shot had found its mark. Raven staggered, the outlaw's pistol discharging harmlessly into the dirt as he fell. The silver bullet had struck his gun arm, not a killing shot, but enough to disable the threat to Shadow. But the second shot hadn't come from Raven. On the street below, Clayton was struggling beneath Shadow's weight. Blood darkened the trapper's coat, not from the wolf's teeth but from a bullet wound in his shoulder. One of his own men had fired from the livery doorway, either missing his target or intentionally shooting Clayton in the confusion. "Hold your fire!" Elias shouted, slinging his rifle and descending quickly from the roof. "Henrik, secure those men in the stable." The blacksmith moved with surprising agility for his size, his shotgun leveled at the 2 gang members who had emerged from the livery. They surrendered without resistance, clearly realizing their plan had collapsed. Shadow backed away from Clayton, who clutched his bleeding shoulder and cursed. "This changes nothing, Ward. The town won't believe you over me." "They will when they see what you were planning," Martha called, approaching with her rifle still ready. "The false evidence, the body you brought to stage an attack." Raven had pulled himself to his feet, his wounded arm hanging useless at his side. Despite the injury, his cold eyes showed calculation rather than defeat. From his boot, he drew a silver-handled knife, the blade catching moonlight as he lunged not at Elias, but at Clayton. "You said this would be clean," Raven snarled. "No complications." Shadow reacted with lightning speed, intercepting the outlaw before he could reach Clayton. Wolf and man went down in a tangle of limbs and snarls. The silver knife skittered across the dirt. Elias rushed forward, his own knife drawn, but there was no need for intervention. Shadow had pinned Raven without drawing blood, massive paws, holding the outlaw immobile against the ground. The wolf's teeth were bared inches from Raven's throat, a growl rumbling through his chest. For Elias, time seemed to slow. Here was the man who had destroyed his family, helpless beneath the wolf that had somehow restored his humanity. One word from Elias, and Shadow could end Raven's life. Justice, or something darker, was his to command. Elias. Martha's voice cut through his thoughts. She stood beside him, her hand gentle on his arm. "This isn't why you became a ranger." The silver-handled knife lay in the dirt between them, an ornate weapon meant for display as much as violence. Exactly the sort of flashy tool a man like Raven would carry. A man who killed for pleasure as much as profit. Elias picked up the knife, studying his reflection in its polished blade. The face that looked back was not the broken man who had fled into the wilderness 15 years ago, but someone new, someone forged through connection rather than isolation. "Shadow," he called softly. "That's enough." The wolf's ears flicked back, golden eyes meeting Elias's. A moment of communication passed between them, beyond words or signals. Shadow stepped back, releasing Raven but remaining vigilant, ready to pounce again if needed. By now, more townsfolk had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Old Tom emerged from the livery, his face grim. "You all need to see this," he said. "What they brought to deceive us." Inside, the wrapped body had been partially uncovered. A drifter who'd passed through town the previous week, his corpse mutilated post-mortem to resemble animal attacks. Beside him lay several tufts of wolf fur and a set of crude wooden tools shaped to leave false paw prints in the dirt. The evidence was irrefutable. Gasps and murmurs spread through the gathering crowd as the full extent of Clayton's deception became clear. "There's more," Henrik announced, holding up papers he'd found in Clayton's saddlebag. Forged deeds to the old silver mine and maps marking a new vein. Sheriff Harlan arrived, having ridden hard upon hearing the gunshots from the edge of town. His weathered face registered shock, then resolution, as he took in the scene and listened to multiple witnesses. "Ranger Ward," he said formally, "seems you've uncovered quite the conspiracy." Clayton struggled against the townsman holding him. "The wolf attacked me. You all saw it. We saw a wolf pin you down without drawing blood," Miss Abernathy countered, "while you were attempting to frame it for murder." As Harlan organized the prisoners for transport to the county jail, Elias knelt beside Shadow, checking the wolf for injuries. Finding none, he pressed his forehead briefly against the massive grey head in a gesture of gratitude and kinship. "What happens to him now?" Martha asked quietly. Elias looked at the wolf who had changed everything. "That's for him to decide." Dawn painted the mountains gold as Elias stood outside the jailhouse. Inside, Clayton and Raven occupied separate cells, both men sullen in defeat. Raven's wounded arm had been treated by Martha, though she'd shown none of her usual bedside manner with the outlaw who'd caused so much pain. Sheriff Harlan emerged, rubbing his tired eyes. "Marshal's sending men to transport them to the territorial prison. Should be here by tomorrow." Elias nodded. "And the mine?" "According to these," Harlan held up the forged mine deed, its elaborate calligraphy now revealed as worthless artifice, Clayton was claiming ownership through a fictional uncle. He's been planning this for months, maybe longer. The forged document represented everything corrupt about Clayton's scheme, using fear, manipulation, and violence to steal what wasn't his. Regardless of who was hurt in the process, the new silver vein is real enough, Harlan continued. The assayer confirmed it. Rich deposit too. Town council's already talking about reopening operations, bringing in jobs. Good for Timber Creek, Cilius said, meaning it. The town had struggled in recent years. Good for its ranger too, Harlan said with a meaningful look. 15% finder's fee is standard for mineral discoveries. Elias shook his head. I didn't find it. Clayton did. Clayton forfeited any claim when he committed fraud and conspiracy to murder, the sheriff countered. And the legal owner is whoever files the proper claim first. He held out a blank deed form. Thought you might want the honor. Before Elias could respond, commotion erupted from the far end of the street. Shouts and the sound of running feet turned both men's attention toward the general store, where a crowd was rapidly gathering. Now what? Harlan muttered, hand moving to his pistol. They hurried toward the disturbance. The crowd parted for them, revealing the cause of the excitement. Shadow stood in the middle of the street, proudly holding a small child by the collar of her dress. The fabric gripped gently in his massive jaws. The girl, Sarah Peterson, barely 5 years old, seemed completely unafraid, even giggling as the wolf set her down carefully before Martha. She wandered away while her mother was shopping, Martha explained, checking the child for injuries but finding none, headed straight for the creek. Would have fallen in if Shadow hadn't found her, Elias finished, stunned. The wolf had not only refrained from harming the child, but had actively protected her. The girl's mother rushed forward, falling to her knees beside her daughter. Rather than pulling the child away from the wolf in fear, as might have been expected, she looked up at Shadow with tear-filled eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Something shifted in that moment. Elias could feel it ripple through the gathered townsfolk. The feared predator, the monster wolf that had terrified them for weeks, had just saved one of their children. The story Clayton had tried to tell about wolves as mindless killers was crumbling before their eyes. Shadow padded over to Elias's side. sitting regally, as if aware of his changing status in the eyes of the town. Joseph appeared at Elias's elbow, seemingly from nowhere as usual. "The circle completes itself," the old man said cryptically. "A child taken, a child saved," Elias understood. 15 years ago, he had failed to protect his daughter from men like Raven. Today, Shadow had succeeded where he once failed, protecting an innocent when she was most vulnerable. With this realization came another. Raven no longer held power over him. The grief remained, would always remain, but the consuming need for vengeance had been transformed into something else, a determination to protect rather than avenge. "What will you do now, Ranger?" Sheriff Harlan asked, watching as the townsfolk cautiously approached Shadow, their fear giving way to curiosity and even tentative admiration. Elias looked down at the blank mine deed in his hand, then at the wolf beside him. "First, I'm going to file this claim, in the name of Timber Creek, not myself. The town deserves the prosperity, not one man." And after that, Martha had joined them, her eyes meeting Elias's with unspoken questions. After that, Elias gazed toward the mountains, their peaks bright with morning light. "I think Shadow and I have some patrolling to do," Sheriff Harlan chuckled. "Never thought I'd see the day when Timber Creek had a four-legged deputy." "Not a deputy," Elias corrected, resting his hand on Shadow's massive head. "A partner." As if understanding, Shadow leaned slightly against Elias's leg, a gesture of affirmation that needed no translation. The crowd had dispersed, returning to their daily routines, but something had fundamentally changed. The distance Elias had maintained between himself and the town for 15 years seemed to have diminished overnight, and the wolf that should have widened that gap had somehow impossibly helped bridge it instead. Martha touched his arm lightly. "Come by the clinic later? Those stitches should come out." There was more than medical concern in her invitation. Elias nodded, a small smile breaking through the habitual reserve of his expression. "We'll be there," he said, including Shadow in the promise. "We'll both be there." Spring came to the mountains with a rush of green and the music of snowmelt filling the streams. 2 months had passed since the night Clayton and Raven's conspiracy was exposed. The territorial court had sentenced both men to long terms in prison, justice delayed but finally served. Timber Creek was transformed. The reopened silver mine brought prosperity, with new businesses opening and families moving in. The town council had wisely invested the proceeds for long-term stability rather than quick profit. Elias stood on the porch of his new cabin, built on the edge of town where forest met civilization, a perfect boundary for a man who belonged to both worlds. Shadow lounged nearby, his massive form stretched in a patch of morning sunlight. The wolf's injured leg had healed completely, leaving only a slight scar as reminder of their first encounter. "Sheriff's coming," Elias noted. Spotting Harlan riding up the path, Shadow's ears perked up, but he made no move to rise. The wolf had developed clear opinions about the townsfolk. Harlan he respected, Martha he actively welcomed, and children he tolerated with surprising patience. Others received varying degrees of acknowledgement depending on their treatment of Elias. "Morning, Ranger," Harlan called, dismounting with the creaking joints of a man who'd spent too many years in the saddle. "Or should I say sheriff?" Elias grimaced. "The council's still pushing that idea?" "More than pushing." Harlan settled into the chair beside Elias, groaning as his back protested. "They've made the decision. I'm retiring end of month. Doctor's orders." "Martha's orders, you mean?" "Same thing." Harlan pulled something from his vest pocket, a newly minted badge, similar to his own sheriff's star, but with one notable difference. Alongside the traditional design was a small but distinct silhouette of a wolf. Had this made special? "First of its kind," Elias took the badge, turning it over in his hands. The craftsmanship was excellent, the symbolism unmistakable. "I never asked for this, Harlan." "Best sheriffs never do," the older man replied. "They serve because they're needed, not because they want power." He glanced at Shadow. "Besides, you come with the most intimidating deputy in the territory. As if understanding, Shadow yawned, displaying impressive teeth before settling his massive head back onto his paws. Towns changed its mind about wolves pretty quick. Elias observed. Towns changed its mind about a lot of things Hall encountered, including solitary rangers who keep to themselves too much. The reference to Martha remained tactfully unspoken between them. Her regular visits to Elias's new cabin had not gone unnoticed by the townsfolk, nor had his increasingly frequent appearances at community gatherings with Shadow at his side. "I'll think about it," Elias said, tucking the badge into his shirt pocket. Harlan nodded, knowing it was as close to acceptance as he'd get for now. "There's something else. Joseph asked me to give you a message before he left." "Left? Where'd he go?" "Wouldn't say. Just packed up and headed into the high country yesterday." Harlan frowned. "Strangest thing, could have sworn I saw wolf tracks alongside his. Big ones, but not Shadow's." Elias wasn't surprised. Joseph had been increasingly scarce since the confrontation with Clayton and Raven, appearing briefly with cryptic wisdom before vanishing again. What was the message? "Said to tell you the circle is complete." Man and wolf walked together again as in the old stories. Then he said something about watching from the high places. Harlan shook his head. Never could make much sense of him, but Elias understood. Joseph's work, whatever it had truly been, was finished here. The balance he had spoken of was restored. After Harlan departed, Elias removed the new badge from his pocket, studying it in the spring sunlight. Sheriff of Timber Creek. Once, he would have rejected the very idea of such responsibility, such connection to people who might be taken from him. Shadow rose and stretched, then padded over to inspect the badge, sniffing it curiously. "What do you think?" Elias asked. "Ready to be deputized officially?" The wolf's golden eyes met his, intelligence and wildness perfectly balanced. Shadow was not a pet, would never be fully domesticated. He chose to stay with Elias, just as Elias chose to stay with Timber Creek. Both decisions daily renewed, both creating something unique at the boundary between wilderness and civilization. From the direction of town came the sound of children's laughter. The school day must have ended. Soon, as had become their habit, several of the braver children would appear with offerings for Shadow and questions for Elias about life in the mountains. And later, Martha would arrive with dinner and conversation that stretched long into the evening. A routine that had once seemed impossible was now the foundation of a life Elias had never dared to imagine. "Circle complete," he murmured, echoing Joseph's words as he pinned the new badge to his coat. Summer settled over the valley, bringing long golden days and the scent of wildflowers on the warm breeze. Timber Creek's annual Founders' Day celebration was in full swing, tables laden with food, music from a fiddle and harmonica, children running and laughing between games. Elias stood at the edge of the gathering, still uncomfortable with crowds, despite the months of gradual reintegration into town life. The sheriff's badge on his chest felt heavy sometimes, a responsibility he was still learning to carry. Sheriff Ward, young Tommy Peterson, brother to the girl Shadow had rescued, raced up to him, clutching something to his chest. "Miss Abernathy says to give you this." "We all made it." The boy thrust a handmade book into Elias's hands before darting away to rejoin the other children. The cover was crafted from tooled leather scraps, likely donated by the saddle maker. Careful stitching bound rough-cut pages, and painted across the front in a child's careful letters were the words, "The Ranger and His Wolf." Elias opened it, finding pages filled with drawings and simple text. The children had created a storybook of his and Shadow's adventure, complete with colorful illustrations. Clayton was depicted as an exaggerated villain with a curling mustache, while Shadow appeared as a noble, oversized wolf with golden eyes that dominated his face. "They've been working on it for weeks," Martha said, appearing at his side. She looked different today, her usual practical attire replaced with a blue dress that matched her eyes. Miss Abernathy thought it would help the children process everything that happened, make it less frightening. Elias turned the pages, touched by the simple retelling. The final illustration showed him and Shadow standing on a ridge overlooking the town. Protective figures watching over the valley. They've made me some kind of hero, he said, discomfort evident in his voice. You are to them, Martha replied. To all of us. Before he could respond, a commotion arose from the edge of the celebration. Shadow had arrived, padding majestically through the parting crowd. Once a cause for panic, the wolf's appearances in town now elicited excitement, especially from the children. What drew gasps today, however, was not Shadow himself, but his companion. Trailing several yards behind him was another wolf, smaller, with lighter grey fur. A female. Well now, Martha said softly. Seems Shadow's been keeping secrets. The female wolf stopped at the town's edge, clearly unwilling to venture closer to the humans. Shadow paused, looking back at her, then continued to Elias's side. She's beautiful, Elias said quietly, kneeling to greet Shadow with a hand on his massive shoulder.
Friend of yours, I take it?
The wolf's expression, if such a thing were possible, seemed almost smug. The townsfolk kept a respectful distance from the female wolf, continuing their celebration while stealing curious glances. The children naturally were most fascinated, whispering excitedly and pointing. Think she'll stay? Martha asked. Elias shook his head. Not in town, but perhaps nearby? He looked down at the storybook in his hands. Seems this tale isn't finished yet. The best stories never really end, Martha observed. After a moment's hesitation, she added, Speaking of which, I've been meaning to ask you something. Something in her tone made Elias look up sharply. Martha was not a woman given to uncertainty, yet now she seemed almost nervous. The clinic needs expanding, she continued. With all the new families moving to town, I can't keep up. I've written to a doctor I trained with in Denver. He's interested in joining the practice. That's good news, Elias said, not entirely sure why she seemed concerned. He'd need a place to live, Martha pressed on. I was thinking he could take my rooms above the clinic. She took a deep breath. If I were to live elsewhere, understanding dawned slowly. Elias glanced down at Shadow, who was watching this exchange with what could only be described as exasperated patience. My cabin has an extra room, Elias said carefully. Built it thinking Joseph might need a place to stay sometimes. Is that an invitation, Sheriff Ward? Martha asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Before he could answer, Shadow huffed loudly and deliberately walked away, heading back toward his waiting companion at the edge of town. The wolf paused, looking over his shoulder with an expression that somehow communicated both approval and impatience. Elias laughed, the sound surprising him with its ease. I think Shadow's made his opinion clear. Martha's hand found his, their fingers intertwining with the comfortable familiarity that had grown between them over the months. Smart wolf. As the celebration continued around them, Elias found himself thinking of Joseph's words about circles completing. His life had traveled a long, painful arc, from family man to solitary ranger, to whatever he was becoming now. Sheriff, friend, perhaps more than friend to Martha, and partner to a wolf who defied all conventional understanding. Not a circle completed, he realized, but a spiral, returning to similar ground, but at a different level, carrying the wisdom of the journey. Come on, Martha said, tugging his hand. They're about to start the dancing, and the sheriff is expected to participate. Elias groaned, but allowed himself to be led toward the gathering, the children's storybook tucked safely under his arm. Behind them, at the edge of town, Shadow and his companion turned as one and loped away toward the mountains, drew silhouettes against the setting sun. 2 years passed, bringing changes to Timber Creek and its inhabitants. The town had grown, its prosperity built on silver and the reputation of being the place where wolves and humans had found an unusual peace. Visitors came from as far as Denver to see the legendary sheriff and his wolf deputy. Elias adjusted the collar of his formal shirt, uncomfortable in the stiff fabric, but unwilling to complain on this particular morning. Through the small window of the church's back room, he could see townsfolk filing into the whitewashed building, dressed in their Sunday best. Nervous, Sheriff Harlan, retired now but still bearing the title out of respect, asked with a knowing smile. Terrified, Elias admitted. His hand went unconsciously to the wolf's tooth, hanging from a leather cord around his neck. A talisman he'd worn for nearly a year now. He'd found it outside his door the morning after he'd helped Shadow's mate deliver a difficult litter of pups. The she-wolf had appeared at his cabin in the middle of a storm, clearly in distress. Martha's medical knowledge and Elias's gentle hands had saved her and her 4 pups. The next morning the tooth had appeared, a gift, Joseph had later explained when he briefly reappeared, representing acceptance into the pack. "She's waiting," Harlan reminded him gently. "Not wise to keep Dr. Sullivan waiting on her wedding day." Elias nodded, squaring his shoulders. The journey from broken, solitary man to sheriff and now bridegroom seemed impossible, yet here he stood. "Shadow?" he asked. "Outside with his family," Harlan answered. "All 5 of them, though those pups aren't so small anymore. The wolf pack had established territory in the hills above Timber Creek. Close enough for Shadow to maintain his connection with Elias, but wild enough for his mate and growing offspring to thrive. The arrangement had evolved naturally, with Shadow spending several days each week in town with Elias, then returning to his pack. Their routine had expanded to include regular patrols of the valley, with Shadow's keen senses proving invaluable for tracking lost travelers or detecting trouble before it reached town. The wolf had even begun training his yearling pups to assist, creating a unique security network that extended throughout the surrounding wilderness. The church bells rang, calling Elias to his place at the altar. As he stepped from the preparation room, a low whine caught his attention. Shadow sat at the church's side door, golden eyes watching intently. "Didn't think you'd come inside," Elias said softly. The wolf rose and padded over, surprisingly dignified despite being wildly out of place in the house of worship. He circled Elias once, sniffing his formal attire with what seemed like approval, then sat again. "Are you giving me away, or standing as my best man?" Elias asked with a smile. Shadow merely blinked slowly, his expression inscrutable as always. Henrik the blacksmith appeared in the doorway, now serving as town mayor. "It's time, Sheriff. Everyone's seated." He glanced at Shadow without surprise. "Will your partner be joining the ceremony?" "Apparently so." Henrik nodded as if this were perfectly normal. "Miss Abernathy saved a space at the front. Said she figured he'd want a good view." The wedding itself passed in a blur for Elias. He would later remember only fragments. Martha's radiant smile as she walked toward him in her blue dress. A Shadow sitting attentively beside Henrik at the altar. The weight of the simple gold band as he slipped it onto Martha's finger, and the scent of wildflowers that filled the small church. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, beaming at the couple who had become central to Timber Creek's remarkable story. As they turned to face the congregation, Elias caught sight of a familiar figure at the back of the church. Joseph stood by the doors, his ancient face creased in a rare smile. He nodded once to Elias, then slipped outside before anyone else seemed to notice his presence. The celebration spilled onto the town square afterward, with tables of food and music from a proper band brought in from the county seat. Children ran between adults, some pausing to cautiously offer treats to Shadow, who had taken up his customary position at the edge of the gathering, watchful but engaged. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Shadow's mate appeared at the edge of town with their nearly grown pups. The young wolves were rangy and bold, much like their father, though they maintained a safe distance from the human celebration. Martha joined Elias as he watched the wolf family. "Your other family seems to be doing well," she observed, slipping her arm through his. "Our family," Elias corrected, touching the wolf tooth at his neck. "All of them," Martha smiled, understanding the depth of what he meant. "Our family," she agreed. From the ridge above town came a long, melodic howl. Joseph's voice lifted in what could only be a blessing. The wolves answered in chorus, their song echoing across the valley as day faded toward evening. 10 winters had passed since a lone ranger freed a trapped wolf in the mountains above Timber Creek. The town had prospered, growing into a respectable settlement with a school, a proper clinic, and a reputation for unusual harmony with the wilderness that surrounded it. Elias Ward stood on the high ridge, silver threading his beard and deepening the lines around his eyes. At 55, he still moved with the fluid strength of a lifetime spent in the mountains, though perhaps a bit slower on the cold mornings. Beside him stood Shadow, his once sleek grey coat now frosted with age. Golden eyes, slightly clouded, but still alert. They had followed this ridge trail together hundreds of times, their partnership a constant while everything else changed around them. Elias reached down to touch the weathered wooden marker that stood at the trail junction. Carved into its surface were 2 distinct tracks, a boot print and a wolf's paw, side by side. Similar markers dotted the boundaries of their shared territory, symbols recognized and respected by both the human and wolf communities. "One more round?" Elias asked. Shadow huffed, a sound that might have been agreement or resignation, and moved forward along the familiar path. Their patrol had shortened in recent years, accommodations made for aging bodies, but neither seemed ready to abandon the ritual entirely. From this vantage point, Elias could see the cabin he shared with Martha, expanded now to accommodate their 10-year-old daughter Sarah, named for the child he'd lost so long ago. Martha's medical practice had grown with the town, her reputation drawing patients from surrounding settlements. She had trained several apprentices, ensuring her knowledge would continue to serve the community. Beyond the cabin, Timber Creek spread through the valley, smoke rising from chimneys against the winter sky. The mine still produced enough silver to sustain the town, though they had diversified wisely over the years. Many visitors came simply to see the place where wolves and humans had established an unusual peace. Shadow suddenly tensed, ears forward, attention fixed on something moving through the trees below. 3 younger wolves emerged, Shadow's offspring from different litters, now full-grown and part of the extended pack that roamed the valley. The wolves had developed their own patrol patterns, keeping other predators away from both the town and their territory. One of the wolves, a large male with his father's bearing, carried something in his mouth. He approached Shadow and Elias with respectful caution, then placed a rabbit at their feet. An offering, or perhaps a report of successful hunting. "Thank you." "Scout," Elias said, having named each of Shadow's offspring years ago. The younger wolf dipped his head in what appeared remarkably like acknowledgement before retreating with his siblings. They would continue their own patrol, while Shadow and Elias completed theirs. "Your children are well trained," Elias observed. "Better than some deputies I've had." Shadow gave him a sideways look that needed no translation. As they continued along the ridge, Elias spotted a familiar figure waiting at the lookout point. Joseph, somehow unchanged by the passing years, his leather-like face creased in the same ancient patterns. "I wondered if you'd appear today," Elias said as they approached. "It's been a while. Some stories need space to unfold," Joseph replied cryptically. "Others require a witness at the right moments." Shadow greeted the old man with familiar ease, accepting the gentle hand on his graying muzzle. "He grows old," Joseph observed. "As do you." "We all do," Elias replied. "Except you, apparently." Joseph smiled. "I age in different ways." He looked out over the valley. "You have created something rare here, Ranger. A place where old enemies remember how to be brothers. Shadow did as much as I did," Elias said. "Maybe more, of course. That is why the story needed both of you." Joseph turned back to them, his dark eyes reflecting something ancient and knowing. The circle nears completion again. Before Elias could ask what he meant, a child's voice called from down the trail. Sarah Ward appeared, bundled against the winter cold, her dark hair escaping her woolen cap. "Papa! Mama says to come home for supper." Her eyes brightened at the sight of Shadow. "Hello, old friend." The wolf's tail swept once in greeting, his demeanor gentler with the child than with anyone else. Sarah reached them, slightly out of breath from the climb. "Joseph, are you coming for supper too?" "Mama made extra," Elias blinked in surprise. He hadn't realized his daughter knew the old man, though perhaps he shouldn't have been surprised. Joseph appeared when and to whom he chose. "Perhaps another time, little one," Joseph replied with unusual warmth. "I have other paths to walk tonight." As Sarah took her father's hand to lead him home, Joseph stepped closer to Elias. "Remember, Ranger, when the time comes, that endings are also beginnings." Elias glanced at Shadow, understanding dawning. The wolf was old, perhaps in his final winter. The thought brought an ache he wasn't prepared for. "Nothing truly ends," Joseph added, as if hearing his thoughts. "The mountain remembers." The story continues. From the ridge above them came a chorus of howls, Shadow's extended family calling as daylight faded. The old wolf lifted his head, answering with a voice still strong and clear despite his years. Elias stood with his daughter's hand in his oldest friend at his side, watching the sun set over the valley they had all protected and transformed. The boundary marker between wilderness and civilization, between past and future, cast a long shadow across the snow-covered trail as day surrendered to evening. Some boundaries, he had learned, were not barriers but meeting places. Some stories had no true ending,